October 14th, 1943. Kalamata, Greece. A cool morning wind rolled in from the Messenian Gulf, carrying the salt of the sea and the distant hum of German trucks. In a narrow stone workshop off Aristomenes Street, 32-year-old radio repairman Nikolaos Marinakis leaned over a battered civilian receiver, its casing cracked, its dials frozen from months of neglect. His hands moved with a calm precision that belied the times. Greece had been 3 years under Axis occupation, and radios, once a common household luxury, had become instruments of suspicion, confiscation, and quiet rebellion. Nikolaos kept his shop alive by repairing what few sets the Germans allowed civilians to keep, but most of his real work happened out of sight. The hidden circuitry, the salvaged vacuum tubes, the improvised antennas threaded through attic beams to pick up BBC transmissions the occupiers tried to smother. This morning, though, his eyes were drawn again and again toward the window. A strange vibration in the air, low and rhythmic, pulsed through the streets. Heavy aircraft engines, but not distant enough to ignore. He knew the sound. Junkers, possibly Heinkels. The Luftwaffe often used the Kalamata airstrip for operations toward the Aegean, yet the cadence felt off, more urgent, more strained. Civilians on the street looked up uneasily. Even the German checkpoint outside the post office appeared tense, soldiers scanning the sky as if expecting something unwelcome. Nikolaos turned the broken radio face down, tools scattered around him, and walked to the doorway. The engine noise thickened, growing into a throaty metallic roar. A formation was approaching, low enough that the vibrations rattled the glass jars of screws and spare capacitors inside his shop. Then, faintly, like a whisper slithering under static, he heard the high-pitched whine of an engine struggling to hold altitude. He knew aircraft well, not as a pilot, but as a lifelong tinkerer. Growing up, he had dismantled old telegraph circuits, wired batteries from tin plates, and built crystal receivers from discarded copper coils. So when he heard the sputter in that engine, he recognized not just mechanical trouble, but desperation. The plane was losing power. Down the street, a German Feldgendarmerie sergeant shouted to his men, pointing upward. Sunlight broke through the clouds, and the shadow of a large bomber swept across the buildings. It was a Junkers Ju-88. One of the Luftwaffe's most versatile and feared aircraft, fast, adaptable, used for bombing, reconnaissance, even night interception. But this one was limping, its starboard engine coughing out plumes of black smoke. From the angle of its descent, Nikolaos could tell it wasn't performing a normal landing pattern. It was trying to reach the Kalamata airfield, and failing. As the bomber lurched southwest, there came a distant metallic pop. A sound Nikolaos had once heard when repairing a shot-up generator for a resistance cell outside Meligalas. Engine backfire. Something inside the Junkers had failed catastrophically. Inside Nikolaos's chest, 2 instincts collided. The instinct to survive and keep his head down, and the instinct to observe, to understand the machines that ruled the war from the sky. The latter won. He stepped outside, pulling his work apron off, and began walking toward the coastal road. The plane's path curved lower, wobbling unevenly. Within seconds, it was clear. The Junkers would not make the airfield. It was coming down. People scattered, German soldiers yelling at civilians to get indoors, but Nikolaos kept watching, his mind racing, not with fear, but with calculations, altitude, velocity, wind direction, smoke output. The bomber would come down northeast of the port, maybe on the olive groves, maybe. A thunderous crack tore through the air as the left landing gear clipped a cypress tree. The plane lurched in a violent arc, smashed through a low stone wall, and skidded across a field in a cloud of dirt and shattered metal. Flames licked the fuselage. The starboard engine tore off entirely, sliding into a ditch. A shockwave rippled across the ground, shuddering through Nikolaos's shoes, even from half a kilometre away. For a moment the field was silent. Only the wind and the settling debris spoke. Nikolaos's breath caught, not in horror, but with the unsettling feeling that this crash, This exact moment would draw him into something far beyond a broken radio set. The Germans would lock down the area. They would interrogate witnesses. They would seize anything related to the crash. And yet, Nikolaos felt himself moving toward the smoke, pulled by an urgent curiosity he couldn't justify. When he reached the outskirts of the crash site, German soldiers were already arriving on motorcycles. One officer raised a pair of binoculars, lips muttering curses at the sight of the burning wreckage. But Nikolaos noticed something none of the soldiers seemed to care about: a strange pattern in the smoke trail the bomber had left in its final descent. The black plume had been uneven, pulsing like bursts of pressure, indicative not of simple mechanical failure, but sabotage inside the fuel line or ignition system. He crouched near a charred fragment of metal blown far from the fuselage. It was a housing panel from the engine casing, punctured cleanly, not jagged like flak damage, but drilled with precision. Too clean, too intentional. This wasn't an accident. In the months before this day, rumours had swirled across southern Greece. Sabotage inside German supply lines, unexplained malfunctions, aircraft grounded by mysterious electrical failures. Few believed them. Germans blamed partisans, civilians whispered about Allied agents. But as Nikolaos traced the edge of the perforation with his thumb, he understood instantly what he was looking at. A pattern that matched a resistance technique he had been told about but never seen. A technique using radio frequency interference. Inside the crashed junkers, faint cries for help echoed from surviving crew members trapped under twisted metal. German soldiers rushed past Nikolaos without noticing him, focused on rescuing their comrades. The wind carried the smell of burning fuel and scorched rubber. Nikolaos's mind churned. He had spent years building receivers, modifying oscillators, crafting narrowband transmitters from scavenged parts. Radio waves were invisible, but their power, when precisely tuned, could disrupt, distort, and destabilize sensitive electrical systems. Allied intelligence knew this. Greek resistance groups knew this, but the Germans thought themselves immune, protected by shielding and reinforced circuitry. Yet this junkers had fallen from the sky, not from flak, not from fuel shortage, but from an electrical collapse that began inside the starboard engine, coinciding with the exact moment locals had reported strange interference in their radios earlier that morning. Interference that originated from a source close to Kalamata. Nikolaos swallowed hard, suddenly aware of the enormity of what he might be implicated in. He walked the perimeter of the field, keeping his distance as more German troops cordoned off the area. One officer barked orders for engineers to inspect the wreckage, but Nikolaos had already pieced together something the Germans had not yet realized. The bomber had been brought down intentionally, using a technology they did not believe the local resistance possessed. And the only person in Kalamata with the knowledge, skill, and equipment to create such a device was standing in that field right now. Nikolaos felt a weight settle on his chest, not guilt, but the heavy certainty that whether or not he had intended to be part of this operation, the Germans would soon come looking for answers. And in occupied Greece, curiosity alone could get a man executed. He turned back toward town, walking briskly. The distant engines of German trucks roared as reinforcements moved in. Civilians were being questioned already, forced into lines along the road. Nikolaos ducked into an alleyway, heart pounding. His workshop, his tools, his spare tubes, his homemade transmitter, everything could now be considered incriminating. But as he hurried home, a young boy, barefoot, breathless, darted out from behind a stack of crates and grabbed his sleeve. "Mr. Nikolaos," the boy whispered urgently, eyes wide with fear and excitement. "The others want to see you. They said you must come now, before the Germans do." Nikolaos froze. There was only one group the boy could mean: the Andates, the local resistance fighters. And if they wanted him immediately, then the crash of that junkers had not been an accident of fate. It had been the opening move of something larger, something that would drag an ordinary radio repairman into the center of a danger he had spent 3 years trying to avoid. He followed the boy down the darkened alley, each step pulling him deeper into the currents of war, resistance, and the unseen battlefield of radio waves that would soon determine life or death for many. Behind him, smoke still rose from the fields, and German soldiers shouted commands in tightening circles. Nikolaos did not look back. He didn't need to. He already knew the crash was only the beginning. Nikolaos followed the boy through the twisting back alleys of Kalamata, past shuttered shops and courtyards, where women hung laundry with anxious glances toward the columns of smoke rising from the olive groves. The German presence intensified by the minute. Soldiers rushed toward the crash site, their boots hammering against cobblestone. Patrols doubled. Streets were blocked. Civilians were interrogated. It was as though the Luftwaffe bomber had been a crack of thunder, signaling a coming storm. By the time Nikolaos reached a small, abandoned storage room behind a carpenter's workshop, 3 resistance members were already waiting for him. Their faces were tense, shadowed by the shifting light coming through the wooden slats. The leader, Dimitris Kouros, a former schoolteacher who had turned to sabotage after his younger brother was executed by German forces, stepped forward. "We don't have much time," Dimitris said quietly. "They're searching houses. They'll reach your shop soon." Nikolaos nodded, his heart thudding. "Tell me exactly what happened this morning. I need the truth." Dimitris exchanged a look with the other 2 men, Petros and Vangelis, both younger, both carrying makeshift weapons. Dimitris lowered his voice. "That interference the neighbors heard. It wasn't an accident. The bomber was part of a reconnaissance unit that's been mapping partisan routes. Command wanted it gone before it completed its sweep." "And you used a radio frequency strike?" Nikolaos asked, stunned. "No," Dimitris replied. "You did." For a moment, Nikolaos felt as though the air had been knocked out of him. "What are you talking about?" Dimitris gestured for him to sit on an old crate. "Last night, one of the boys, Mikhail, stole a small transmitter from your workshop while you were asleep. He overheard you speaking weeks ago about oscillation interference, about how you could push certain circuits to overload if you hit the right frequency. We needed something quick, something unseen. A gunshot draws attention. Sabotage on the airfield is impossible now." "But radio waves, they leave no fingerprints." Nikolaos felt a chill crawl up his spine. He remembered Mikhail, a wiry teenage courier who often lingered near the shop, fascinated by the glow of vacuum tubes. He stole a device, tuned it incorrectly, and used it on a moving aircraft. That's suicide. "No," Dimitris corrected again, eyes steady. "He tuned it using notes you scribbled on the margin of a repair invoice. He thought it was written for him." Nikolaos shut his eyes. The notes had been for himself, a theoretical exploration of how unshielded German engine components might react to modulated pulses. He had never intended them as instructions. He had never meant for anyone to touch that equipment, especially not a boy. "Mikhail triggered the pulse from an abandoned hilltop house outside Verga," Petros said. "We didn't expect it to work, none of us did, but when the Junkers passed overhead," he gestured toward the rising smoke, "you saw the result." Nikolaos opened his eyes slowly, the weight of responsibility pressing onto his chest. "Is Mikhail alive?" "Yes," Dimitris said. "But the Germans recovered part of the housing panel from the crash. They're already searching for anyone with electronic skills." He paused, then added gravely, "You are the only man in Kalamata capable of creating what brought that bomber down. They will assume it was you." Nikolaos inhaled sharply. "So I'm already condemned?" "No," Dimitris said firmly. "Not if you leave with us, tonight." Before Nikolaos could respond, Vangelis stepped to the doorway, listening intently. "German patrol," he whispered. Footsteps echoed, voices barked orders. The resistance fighters bristled, hands tightening around weapons. Then the steps passed by, fading away. Dimitris turned back to Nikolaos. "The Germans lost a valuable aircraft. They won't let it go. They'll interrogate everyone near the field. They'll tear apart your shop. We have a plan, but it requires your cooperation and your knowledge." "What knowledge?" Nikolaos asked, confused. Dimitris leaned closer, lowering his voice further. "Mikhail's device worked, but we don't fully understand why. If we can refine it, if we can replicate the effect, then we might be able to target more than just reconnaissance planes, supply transports, command flights, even fuel convoys." Nikolaos nearly recoiled. "You want to weaponize a radio anomaly barely understood?" "We want to undermine the occupation," Dimitris said calmly. "And you are the only one who can do this safely. If you refuse, the Germans will capture you. If you accept, we'll take you to the mountains tonight." The room fell silent. Outside, a German jeep roared by. Nikolaos stared at his hands, steady hands that had repaired hundreds of radios but had never held a weapon. All his life, he had believed resistance was something for others, fighters, soldiers, men with the courage to wield rifles in the dark. He had thought himself a civilian, a repairman, a man who survived by remaining useful but unnoticed. But now, the war had noticed him. He met Dimitris's gaze. "If we do this," he said slowly, "we must do it correctly. Those devices can overload more than aircraft circuits. They can kill people nearby. They can burn out entire generators. They must be tuned carefully." Dimitris nodded. "Then teach us." Before Nikolaos could answer, Petros pressed his ear to the wall. "They're questioning the carpenter next door," he warned. A muffled German voice carried through the boards, demanding papers. Another voice, shaking, responded. Heavy boots scraped the ground. The atmosphere thickened. Dimitris moved quickly. "We need to relocate now. There's an old citrus warehouse on the edge of town where we can speak freely." They slipped out of the storage room and moved through narrow alleys, hugging shadows and stepping around crates and discarded sacks of olives. German patrol routes multiplied. Pairs of soldiers standing at corners, rifles slung low, stopping citizens at random. Twice they froze, flattening themselves against cold stone walls as patrols passed. Once, a German soldier stepped so close that Nikolaos could smell the tobacco on his breath. The soldier paused, listening. Nikolaos's pulse hammered so loudly he feared it would echo off the walls. Then the soldier moved on. They reached the outskirts of Kalamata as dusk crept across the sky. The warehouse sat beside a grove of lemon trees, the air scented with citrus and sea salt. Inside, crates lay stacked in rows, abandoned after the Germans seized most of the produce months ago. Dimitris lit a single oil lamp, its glow casting long shadows. "Before we begin," Nikolaos said, steadying himself, "I need to know the truth. Was this your plan? To steal my transmitter? To experiment on a moving bomber?" "No," Dimitris said, his voice heavy. "The plan was sabotage on the airfield, but German guards doubled last week. When Mikhail stole the transmitter, the others wanted to punish him. I didn't allow it. The boy said you once told him every machine has a weakness if you understand its language. He wanted to help. He wanted to matter." Vangelis sighed. "He's young. Too eager." "Eager or not," Nikolaos said, "he did something extraordinary and incredibly dangerous. If we're going to improve the device, I need to see exactly what he built." Dimitris motioned to a crate. Inside it lay the small transmitter, battered, hastily assembled, antenna wires twisted like veins. Nikolaos lifted it, examining the coils, the jury-rigged power supply, the cracked frequency dial. He felt both admiration and horror. A small shift in voltage could have killed Mikhail. An incorrect frequency could have fried half the hillside with him. "I'll need tools," Nikolaos muttered. "Precision ones." "We have some," Petros said, setting down a worn leather pouch. Nikolaos opened it, surprised to find a reasonably intact multimeter, pliers, stripped copper wire, and even a salvaged capacitor. "Where did you get these?" "German scrap bin behind the naval depot," Vangelis grinned. "Their trash is our treasure." Nikolaos set to work. Hours passed as he tested circuits, recalibrated coils, and rewired connections. The resistance fighters watched in silence, fascinated by how the quiet man from the radio shop transformed into something else. Confident, analytical, utterly immersed. At one point, Dimitris leaned in. "Can this bring down another bomber?" Nikolaos hesitated. "Theoretically, yes, but only under the right conditions. Range, altitude, angle, all must align. And the frequency must strike a precise harmonic. This device didn't simply disrupt the engine, it triggered a resonance failure inside an unshielded ignition coil. The Germans won't realize this immediately, but once they investigate the crash thoroughly, they'll understand it wasn't normal sabotage." "And when they do?" Dimitris asked. Nikolaos looked up gravely. "They will begin hunting not just radios, but the people who understand them." Silence fell. Outside, distant boots marched along the road as new patrols spread through the area. The scent of smoke from the bomber drifted faintly in the air. Dimitris spoke quietly. "We leave for the mountains at sunrise. There's an Ellis outpost near Taygetus. They'll shelter you. And from there, if you agree, we can continue these experiments." Nikolaos looked at the transmitter in his hands, this accidental weapon built from spare parts and desperation. He thought of Mikol, alone on a hilltop with the wind howling around him. He thought of German soldiers already knocking on doors. He thought of the Junkers ripping through the air before tumbling into the earth. "This isn't just resistance anymore," he said. "This is a new front in the war. One they won't see coming until it's too late." Dimitris nodded solemnly. Nikolaos exhaled slowly. "Very well. At dawn, I'll go with you. But first, I need to test something. If I'm right, we can increase the range threefold without increasing the risk." "Show us," Dimitris said. Nikolaos adjusted the coil. The transmitter hummed gently, like a heartbeat made of electricity. He tuned the dial, listening to the pitch shift. The men around him leaned in. Outside, the first German trucks rumbled toward the warehouse district, and just as Nikolaos tightened the final screw, the lamp flickered. Then the warehouse fell into darkness. The transmitter was still humming. Somebody had cut the power to the district, and the Germans were closer than any of them had realized. Darkness swallowed the warehouse in an instant. The oil lamp's flames sputtered out with a soft hiss as Nikolaos, Dimitris, Petros and Vangelis froze. The transmitter continued to hum in Nikolaos's hands, its faint vibration the only sign of life in a suddenly silent world. For a few heartbeats, no one moved. No one breathed. Outside, the distant drone of engines persisted, accompanied by intermittent shouts in German. Dimitris whispered, "They've cut power to the whole district. They're isolating sectors." Nikolaos set the transmitter down gently. "They're closing in. They know someone with technical knowledge lives in this area." Vangelis edged toward a boarded window. After a tense moment, he peered through a crack. "Patrols on both ends of the street," he murmured. "Trucks blocking the road to the port. They're sweeping door to door with lanterns." "Then we move now," Petros said. His voice trembled slightly, not out of fear, but urgency. "If they reach the orchard, they'll surround the warehouse." Dimitris placed a hand on Nikolaos's shoulder. "Take the transmitter. Wrap it in cloth. We go through the lemon grove to the irrigation ditch. It leads all the way to the old stone bridge. From there, we slip into the hills." Nikolaos nodded, sweeping tools into his satchel, wrapping the transmitter in burlap. At the warehouse's rear, a small wooden door creaked open. Cool night air rushed in, smelling of earth and citrus. Moonlight slanted across the grove, casting long shadows between the trees. The four men slipped into the orchard, moving quickly but carefully. Every rustle of leaves felt too loud. Every crack of twig snapped against their nerves. Patrol dogs barked somewhere behind them, followed by angry German commands. Halfway through the grove, a spotlight swept across the tops of the lemon trees, illuminating curls of mist drifting from the soil. Nikolaos ducked instinctively, heart thudding as bright white light passed just meters overhead. "We're running out of time," Dimitris whispered. "The ditch is close." They moved faster, leaves brushing against their shoulders, branches snagging their clothes. Nikolaos held the transmitter close, every step a reminder of the danger it represented, not just to him, but to everyone in the resistance. Finally, the grove gave way to the irrigation ditch. a narrow trench carved through the earth, barely a metre wide, carrying only a thin trickle of water this time of year. Demetrius motioned for them to climb in. One by one, they lowered themselves into the trench, the earth cool and damp beneath their hands. "Stay low," Demetrius whispered. "They'll search the grove, but they won't look down here unless they hear us." For nearly 20 minutes, they crawled through the ditch, using the low walls as cover. The moon drifted in and out of sight behind the trees, and the faint murmur of the sea echoed somewhere in the distance. But behind them, German voices grew louder. Boots crushed leaves, branches cracked. The search had reached the orchard. Petros stopped suddenly. "Listen." They all froze. Above them, on the ditch's edge, 2 German soldiers stood silhouetted against the sky. One shined a lantern along the ground, the other pointed a rifle, muttering something about partisans. The beam swept dangerously close to the ditch. Nikolaos felt his breath lock in his throat. Then, mercifully, the soldiers turned away, trudging deeper into the grove. The light faded. Demetrius exhaled silently and motioned forward. By the time they emerged near the stone bridge, the first faint hints of dawn tinged the horizon. Birds began to stir in the olive trees, but there was no time to rest. Kalamata would soon be completely locked down. From the bridge, footpaths spidered up the foothills of Mount Taygetus. The men began their climb, pulling themselves over rocks, slipping between thickets, moving with the urgency of hunted animals. At one point, Nikolaos paused, turning back toward the town. In the dim light, he saw the glow of lanterns spreading through the streets. The Germans were still searching. Demetrius touched his arm. "Don't look back. If they find you, they'll force you to rebuild the transmitter. For them." That thought chilled Nikolaos more deeply than the cold mountain wind. He faced forward again and continued climbing. By mid-morning, they reached a small mountain outpost, little more than a cluster of stone huts hidden among pine trees. A handful of Elas fighters emerged to greet Demetrius with relief and tension. They brought bread, olives, and water, ushering Nikolaos inside. Inside the primary hut, the atmosphere was thick with smoke from a small fire. Maps of the region were pinned to the walls with makeshift nails. A short, broad-shouldered man named Captain Leventis, leader of the local Elas brigade, stepped forward. "So, this is the man who pulled a German bomber out of the sky with nothing but wires and a box of spare parts," he said, studying Nikolaos with a mix of amusement and awe. "It was an accident," Nikolaos protested immediately, exhausted and wary. "Accident or not," Leventis said, "the Germans are in a frenzy. They believe a British engineer is operating inside Kalamata. They're scouring every workshop for tools. You shook them." He stepped closer. "Tell me what you built." Nikolaos explained everything: the theoretical notes, Mikhail's theft, the accidental harmonics that triggered the Junker's engine collapse. Leventis listened carefully, occasionally glancing at the transmitter wrapped in burlap. When Nikolaos finished, Leventis stroked his beard thoughtfully. "Can you do it again? But this time on purpose?" Nikolaos hesitated. "Yes, but only with a safer design, and only if we have a way to test it without risking civilian lives." Leventis grinned. "We might have just the place." Later that afternoon, they led Nikolaos to a ravine deep in the foothills where a derelict German supply truck, abandoned after partisan attacks, sat rusted and forgotten. Its engine was still intact, though long unused, perfect for experimentation. Nikolaos spent hours rigging the transmitter, adjusting coils, refining resonant frequencies. Demetrius, Petros, and Vangelis stood watch as he worked. By evening, the device was ready. Nikolaos positioned it on a rocky ledge, powering it through a salvaged battery. He tuned the dials slowly, listening for that familiar hum, the one that had brought down a bomber. "Ready?" Nikolaos said quietly. Demetrius signaled to Petros, who turned the truck's ignition manually. The engine coughed, sputtered, and roared to life. Nikolaos adjusted the frequency. The transmitter pulsed, A strange shiver rippled through the air, like the moment before a lightning strike. The truck engine sputtered, once, twice, then choked violently before shutting off completely. Silence. Then, the men exhaled in amazement. "It works," Vangelis whispered. Nikolaos allowed himself a quiet, exhausted smile. "Now imagine that effect directed at an aircraft engine." Leventis slapped Nikolaos's shoulder. "You've just changed the war in the Peloponnese." But the triumph was short-lived. At dawn the next day, a scout arrived breathless at the outpost. "The Germans! They're coming," he panted. "Columns of them, trucks, motorcyclists, dogs. They're heading into the mountains. They found the Lemon Grove Trail." Panic rippled through the outpost. Fighters scrambled for weapons. The air filled with the tense rustling of men preparing for battle. Dimitris grabbed Nikolaos. "If they capture you, everything is lost. You must hide." "No," Nikolaos said firmly. "I won't hide. I'll help." "You're not a soldier," Petros insisted. "No," Nikolaos agreed. "But I have something they don't expect." He held up the transmitter, the refined, tightened, deadly precise version. Leventis frowned. "You can't use that on infantry." "I won't," Nikolaos said. "But the Germans rely on trucks, generators, field radios. If we can disable their equipment before they reach us, if we can throw their communications into chaos, we might delay them long enough for the fighters to escape." Leventis stared at him, then nodded. "Do it." Nikolaos set up the transmitter on a ridge overlooking the narrow pass the Germans would use. He connected the battery, tuned the frequency, and aimed the antenna toward the approaching forces. Below, the first German trucks rumbled forward, engines grumbling through the mountain air. Nikolaos adjusted the coil. The transmitter pulsed. A ripple of invisible energy washed across the pass. Within seconds, the lead truck's engine coughed and stalled. The second sputtered wildly, backfiring. German officers shouted, bewildered, pounding on radios that suddenly screamed with static. Field generators sparked, smoke rising from their casings. Confusion erupted below. Soldiers stumbled over each other, unable to start their trucks, unable to communicate. Dogs whined. Officers cursed. Chaos spread like wildfire. Leventis signaled the fighters. "Fall back! Move now!" While the Germans struggled to understand what had happened, the resistance slipped deeper into the mountains, disappearing into pine forests. Nikolaos followed, exhausted but alive, clutching the transmitter, the strange, improvised, accidental weapon that had now saved more lives than he could count. By midday, the Germans abandoned the pursuit, unable to chase a ghost they couldn't see or understand. Reports would later call it a mass mechanical failure. Others blamed sabotage. None imagined a radio repairman had been behind it. Days later, from a safe ridge overlooking the valleys below, Nikolaos stared at the landscape, thinking of the bomber, the crash, the stolen transmitter, the lemon grove, the frantic escape, and the invisible frequencies that had altered the course of a small part of the war. He wasn't a soldier. He never had been. But in modern war, sometimes the most powerful weapon wasn't a rifle or a grenade. Sometimes it was a man who understood the language of machines. Nikolaos would go on to train resistance groups across the Peloponnese, teaching them how to disrupt German supply lines without firing a shot. He never sought recognition. He never carried a weapon. But years later, after liberation, villagers in Kalamata would tell the story of the quiet radio repairman who brought down a German bomber, not with bullets, but with electricity, courage, and the conviction that even small acts in the shadows could change the daylight of history. And every time Nikolaos walked past Aristomenes Street, he looked toward the fields where that Junkers had fallen, and he wondered how differently things would have turned out if not for a single boy, a stolen transmitter, and the invisible wave that had changed everything.